Thank you all for joining me. I am Tracy Castro-Gill, Executive Director of Washington Ethnic Studies Now, and I'm here with the educators of Concord International Elementary School in South Park, Seattle. And they're going to talk to us about the process behind our last blog post that included student work from the Poetry Slam, how that came to be, their learning from it, and then just some thoughts about ethnic studies in general, especially in dual language and especially in elementary school. So with that, I'm going to ask y'all to introduce yourselves, and then we'll get into the questions.
Jump in there to start. Hi, my name is Jessica Stair. My pronouns are they, them, and I teach K-5 music at Concord International School. One thing that's unique about my position and worthy to note for this discussion is I teach 2/3 of my classes, part of the dual language model, primarily in Spanish, and my instruction in the other group is primarily in English. I'll pass it over to Carly.
I'm Carly Grossons. I use she, her pronouns. This year is my first year teaching 4th grade ever in a self-contained class. So I teach in Spanish and in English. But before that, I think I've taught a total of 8 years of 2nd grade, and I've been a multilingual educator. So I've been around a while.
My name is Selena Martinez, and I teach this year 2nd grade dual language. I've been teaching 1st grade at Concord for 2 years, and then I also got moved to 2nd grade. But I have taught 2nd grade for 14 years in another school district, but it is like a new year, so it's always like a first-year teacher, especially with ethnic studies, so yay. And my pronouns are she, her.
My name is Maggie Dunphy. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the 3rd grade teacher on the English side of the dual language program. So it's my 4th year at Concord, but only my 2nd, hopefully full in-person year. And so it's been really, really fun to work with my partner teacher, Kevin Contreras, for 2 years in a row now. My first time with the same partner teacher twice in a row. Very exciting. And so I wanted to make sure to mention him. He wasn't able to join, but he and I did a lot of joint ethnic studies work last year. So
exciting. Kevin was my student at Seattle U. Yeah. And then I just want to point out too that Jessica is one of the authors of our music framework. So I think
thank you for reminding me of that. I also was one of the contributing authors with Chris Mena for the music ethnic studies framework. Thank you, Tracy.
Of course. Okay, so let's get into the questions. And I think it's important the first question goes first because we get a lot of questions about, how appropriate ethnic studies is for younger students. So considering that question that I receive a lot, what considerations need to be in place for teaching ethnic studies in K-5?
Who wants to go first?
I like how we're all so shy about this. Someone jump in there. Okay, I'll start then. I'm just going to do it. I'm going to be bold again. So, I mean, thinking about how appropriate something is or is not for elementary school, I think that this content is perfectly appropriate and very necessary. So to respond to that piece first, I think like as a child, when I was going through the school system as a BIPOC child in a primarily white district, I experienced racism, whether or not it was developmentally appropriate for me to experience it, right? So I think that one of the things that we need to think about when we're talking about teaching this at the elementary level is giving language to the experiences that students have, so that way they can start to heal and start to discuss these things in the classroom in a place that's safe. So just on that note, I think it's really important, in fact, that we have the language to talk about the things students are experiencing in their everyday. In terms of consideration for teaching this in K-5, I think one of the most important things is wedding the ethnic studies curriculum that you have with anti-racist pedagogy, because why am I going to teach about ethnic studies? Why am I going to teach about identity and power and all of these ethnic studies themes if I'm not also living those values out with students? So I think that being really intentional about the way that you're teaching the material is important too. I'll pass it on to someone else.
I think it was also like really important if I'm going to be teaching ethnic studies that I know my own identity. Just going through the school system, as Jessica was talking about, I wasn't represented like as a person of color, like in books. And so like I had to do a lot of research, and my daughter actually started the research. She's in college now, but she started the research of our ancestry. And, you know, I'd ask my parents questions and they didn't know anything about like the stories of like our great grandparents and things like that. So she started doing the history and I'm like, wow. So I started learning about more about myself and who I was. And then once I did that, I was able to bring that into teaching ethnic studies, because our first unit was identity. And so I had to know my own identity. And it was like, I knew that maybe for the kids, there was going to be some surprises when they asked their families questions, but there was also surprises for me. So like I went through that as an adult, but like it was really uplifting for them doing that work as kids. I didn't see anything. They actually love it, talking about their ancestors. So that's what I would say as a teacher. First is we need to do the self-reflection and know about our own identities. And there's going to be times you have to come to terms with some of the things that your ancestors did, but then also proud of, like, because as a Latinx or Chicana, there's indigenous that I'm like really proud of, that my parents didn't really even know or acknowledge that they were. So yeah, that's like one thing, knowing our own identities before we teach it.
Thanks for sharing that, Selena. That resonates a lot with me too as a white person, particularly working with, well, a white person working with any students, but particularly with BIPOC students, I have the capacity to do so much harm if I'm not doing that work myself before even looking at a framework, before even thinking about what kind of content I am wanting to teach in using that ethnic studies framework. So for me, that's like, of course, an ever long, lifelong learning journey that I'm continuing on, and unlearning and undoing, patterns of harm that my ancestors perpetuated and that I perpetuate too. And so I think that's a huge consideration for me as a white educator, is to make sure that, as the saying goes, I'm also walking the walk as I talk the talk to students. And I think that's really important too, because as we have conversations, that way I'm able to step into it specifically when I'm talking about something like colonization. I'm able to say, like, these are my ancestors, and like this is work that I've done to learn more about where my ancestors come from and their complicity and their active participation in these systems. And then as a white person today, this is my choice to either uphold these systems or to dismantle them. And to be honest with students about when I don't do that well, and to do that work myself is really important. And then I'd say, as far as the argument about working through these topics with students, I think most people would be shocked to know how much students are already picking up on anyway, and how brilliant they are, and how, what I'm looking for, how refreshing their perspectives are in solving problems that adults don't know how to solve. And so I think one of the considerations is just to make sure that we're giving space for students to process in a safe or as safe as possible way, but also to let them share their ideas about how to dismantle some of the systems that we might be teaching about, because they have ideas that we haven't thought of as people who've been steeped in white supremacy for longer.
Wow, all those things. That was love listening to all of you. I guess adding on to all the things that were said, with what Maggie just said, that I find, and Jessica and I were just talking about this yesterday, that it's our problem talking about it, that the kids are so open, and also, like Jessica and Selena said, have experienced this. So we're just giving them the vocabulary and the space to label what's happening to them and their families. And what I find is they're relieved that, oh, that's what's happening to me. And it just builds community and empathy and understanding. And like you've all been saying as well, that they have such a fresh perspective. They haven't been bogged down so much by society yet. And so giving that space just creates such a beautiful community, and just hearing their ideas, and they're so have such a sense of justice and fairness and open to change and seeing the world in a different way. So it's such a beautiful thing and powerful thing to experience with the students. And it just gives me hope that we can create a better place together. And now teaching fourth grade in the older years, the only way that that poetry project could happen at the beginning of the year was just having them have had all of you as educators in this process. So it just was so amazing to see day one how strong they were in their identity, how they had all this background knowledge and vocabulary to just dive right into the language project using the framework from ethnic studies. And then of course, also like you all said, especially being a white educator of all students, especially BIPOC students in a dual language program, just that continual going through, what does that mean? How I perpetuate white supremacy, and to keep analyzing that with ourselves and getting better. And I just feel so lucky to work at our school community, because I've learned so much from all of you, and we've had and we still do have just incredible educators that give PD, like Jessica yesterday on gender. And we had Sharon White that made differentiated cohorts, and we had Maggie and many of our fellow colleagues lead white affinity groups. And of course, all of us going through WASN, and how you've organized that, where it's self-reflection and then being a teacher, self-reflection, and then how am I going to be a better teacher? So just all of those things going together and cycling through is a powerful and important and beautiful process, I think.
One thing I want to add on to that too, just because I feel like what you said, Carly, really speaks to a consideration that's really important about teaching ethnic studies at the elementary level, is that collaboration, is that professional community where we're able to connect with each other. Like I'm remembering back to when Carly's students were working on their poems, right? I was like, oh, they're having this amazing conversation. They would start to bring up things during my class when we were studying the lyrics to songs. And then we're like, okay, how can we connect? And we started to look at some spoken word, and how can we deliver all of these materials, right? Every single time that I'm able to talk to Selena or Maggie or Carly or any of the other educators that are doing really strong ethnic studies units, it really improves that experience for students. And I think that's the reason that we've been able to find success as a school, is because we've been working in collaboration with one another, and we've made a real investment in making sure that every single classroom is able to access ethnic studies, every student in our school. So for all the things that Carly said, the collaboration, it wouldn't be possible without all of us.
Thank you. And I just want to point out, I taught at Denny International Middle School, which is the pathway for Concord, right? So the Concord kids would come through Denny. And I'd have to say that Concord kids were probably the most prepared kids to have the conversations we would have in my classroom. So I think Concord has a long history of working towards culturally sustaining pedagogy and ethnic studies. So I want to call that out and name that y'all have been working on it for a long time there at Concord. So thank you for that. I want to move to the question about how students respond to topics like racism and colonialism, because we've kind of brought that up already. So yeah, how do kids respond when you talk about some of these more disturbing or negative topics in history?
think you have to be really intentional when you're introducing topics like this too, about the framing, because really often in the way that our curriculum has been designed, if you're looking at just kind of like, oh, white stream. That's a term that's been coined by a scholar who I am failing to remember their name in this moment, but I'll make sure that I look that up and drop it in the chat. But if you're looking at kind of like a white stream lesson, it'll really talk about racial oppression and colonialism as something that happened to us, right? Something that we had no agency in. And when it changed, it was like, oh, how benevolent was it that these systems changed and now people of color are fine and good and we're all equal. And teaching through the lens of ethnic studies really challenges that notion that this is something that happened badly, because if we present it in the way that it's traditionally been and the way that I experienced it moving through school, yeah, I would have a very negative reaction to that because I'd see myself as someone that just had suffering happen to them. The only reasons that any of our systems have changed is because of the power of minoritized groups to stand up against that, to advocate for ourselves, to find partnership with one another, to overturn these systems. So when we're talking about things like this in the classroom, like, I'm trying to think of an example. We were talking about like the power of music in our Black Lives Matter lesson plans as well. And when we were talking about this, there's this song that's like, Marsha P. Johnson was a freedom fighter and she taught us how to fight. We're learning from our ancestors. We're learning from the people that came before us, the power in the way that they protest, the power in the way they showed us how to fight against these things that we're encountering. So I know that saying things like racism and colonialism can have this negative connotation, like we're teaching students to be sad or guilty or feel bad about themselves. No, we're teaching them the incredible things that can happen when we work collectively to overturn the problems that we see in the world. So I would say when I see students encountering racism and colonialism, when those topics come up through what we're studying, like there's mourning, right? Because when they see that harm happening, there's definitely like, I don't like that. That doesn't sit well with my values. But there's also pride and power and strength in seeing what people have done to pull those system downs, and also recognizing the work that's left to do. I see a lot of joy in students when we talk about these things.
They actually like talking about these topics. They get really excited, but first we had to build up their identity of talking about their own stories. And so they would go home, and if they didn't know about their immigration story, which every single one of them has an immigration story, and some of them were like, I do, I'm from here. And I'm like, no, everybody has an immigration story. It might be sooner than others, but like way down the line, maybe for you, for certain kids. And it was usually the white kids that would say like, I'm from here. And I'm like, well, maybe you are, but like your ancestors, remember we're connected to our ancestors. They're like, oh yeah. And I go, well, go home, ask your grandparents. And I did make sure I send a letter home of what we were working on, and so they can ask questions. And I see them asking more questions, and I see them like really engaged in the learning. And so like they would come back and they said their own immigration story. So part of ethnic studies is their own immigration stories. And I just pulled down the map and they started talking about their story, just authentically, you know, authentically. And then sharing stories like read alouds of by people of color, and like the Dreamers book. And so they start noticing things in the books, in the illustrations. They start seeing like the racism, and they start talking about it collectively, like in community, because we've already set up like in community. We already have like the class charter of how they want to feel and all that. And so like they're comfortable talking about it because there's respect that they wanted to feel, and there's like happiness. And yeah, so like they set that up, their circle of when we're talking about it and teaching. So I think that that's how I've been teaching it this year, like after the Washington Ethnic Studies. And now PD, it was like really powerful for me just to step back and say, okay, I need to teach it authentically and I need to teach it interdependent of in community. Yeah, so like the immigration lessons were like really powerful and the kids loved it and they still do. Like you hear conversations when we're working on something, our ancestors or things like that. Like now they feel like they're part of something in the past, not just like, and these are second graders. I'm like, wow, this is in second grade. I wish I would have had this when I was a kid. I'm barely like discovering my own identity as an adult. So I could see them like really happy and empowered. And then like
Yeah.
it came up with all the action projects.
Yeah, I think you bring up another point of what to consider, not just in K-5, but in all ethnic studies classroom is building that space, that community in the classroom and that interdependentness. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And I want to recognize that Cynthia has joined us. Do you want to introduce yourself, Cynthia?
Hi, folks. Apologies for being late. I got my booster shot. My name is Cynthia Sarai Cervantes Castañeda, and I am the 5th grade dual immersion teacher at Concord. And I'm happy to be in this space with y'all.
Thank you. And we're answering the question, how do your students respond to topics like racism and colonialism?
Inspired by so many of the things you all brought up, but the thing I just heard Selena say was taking action. So I think the big piece of it is that we learn all these difficult things that have happened and are happening, but we have the collective power to take action and change it now. You don't have to wait. And I always tell them often people listen to children more, and like Jessica said, through the arts, it's such a beautiful way to share that. We're so lucky to have Jessica. They're just always so inspired to write poetry or sing a song to share with others. So I think that's where we find a lot of joy, is that we can take action, and we can take action through the arts and in our own community for the injustices that we see. And of course, bringing it back to our community and how everything basically is happening in the South Park area and with the Duwamish River and the tribe. We have so many things going on here, but also a lot of beauty in the activism in our community. It's just an amazing thing. So just having activists come in and now Zoom in to talk to the class about, and there's the Youth Duwamish Cleanup Coalition, and they're often a lot of the students' siblings. And so they see right away, like, wow, I can be a part of changing this. And then like Selena said, there's so many incredible books. We're reading this one, and she's from Seattle, so she came and talked to us, and all these books talk about really intense history and things that are happening, but they're also beautiful and have such amazing messages and inspiration to share yourself and to take action together or create a book or music or to share with others. So the taking action part, I think, is a part of the joy and the healing process, I think.
Cynthia, did you want to share? I've already shared a couple times. You just joined us. If you want to go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I was reading the questions. I think part of this work in a dual language setting is so important because at least from what I've seen in my classroom, students are able to connect what we're learning in school and take it home and have conversations with their families about it in their language, right? And think through these critical issues with their families, who provide context to them, and then they bring that back home, back to school. A perfect example of this has been a part of the 5th grade curriculum in social studies is U.S. history, geography. And so we've been talking about Latin American countries and what they have in common. And it's very interesting see students use this vocabulary to talk about colonization as a major point of connection, right? And that one of the reasons that, and the major reason why we all speak Spanish is because we all went through this experience together. And so it's a point of connection for students who are Mexican, who are from Guatemala, who are from El Salvador, that can then share these points of history and see them connected to larger movements, right? And it's such a grounding point in our class, and that we're able to talk about it in Spanish. Makes it so much more richer, because then they bring it, y mi mamá me dijo, y mi papá me dijo, y tengo un tío, y tengo una tía. And so these conversations and these histories become alive in our classroom. And so it brings, it positions them within the curriculum that we're learning, because we're not just learning about these foreign things that are outside, that are in maps, that are in books. We're learning about our histories and our positionalities within that curriculum. And I find, like Selena was talking about, like Carly was talking about, that the conversations are that much more richer, because students see themselves reflected in what they're learning, and they know that they're part of these stories. So I think doing this kind of work, and doing it in Spanish, in my case, just brings more intention to the work. It's a lot. It's alive for students, and we have an opportunity to connect it to so much more, than just the classroom. It leaves students, it enters their homes. It's part of the communities that they're in, and then we're all able to bring that back and share and make sense of it. So that's one of the reasons why I've enjoyed doing this work in a dual immersion class.
Yeah, so that's a great segue to that question that I want to be intentional about, because Concord is a dual language immersion school, which means that students learn in Spanish and English, right, together. And there's a lot of data to support that they become stronger readers. Their literacy is higher when they're learning in both languages. And so the question is, and I want to go back to something Carly mentioned to me in an email when we were setting this all up, that she felt it was important to do this translanguaging that we saw in the poems of the students, because some students were turning away from Spanish. The heritage speakers were embarrassed or ashamed to speak Spanish. So keeping that in mind, why is ethnic studies particularly important in a dual language model?
I was thinking about that, and the more and more I was thinking about it, it's that language is part of a person's identity, and kids not wanting to speak it is for somewhere in their life, they're being oppressed. I know from my own experiences of don't speak Spanish, learn English. And so I think it's really important that that part of their identity, which is their language, that they get to keep, because for many, like myself, that even though I'm born here, you're told so much, which is like part of the colonization. And in the schools growing up, just hearing my mom's stories, because I'm like, from my mom's side, third generation, they were told not to speak Spanish and they would get punished for it and things like that. Like that's like stories that I hear. And so when kids aren't wanting to speak Spanish, I'm just thinking like, I have to build them up and say, oh, eres bilingüe, wow, sabes dos idiomas. And there's some kids that know 3, And so I just like try to build them up, but it's really important, because then you raise your family, and there's families like in my family that we don't speak Spanish because it was just oppressed. It was just oppressed upon, and then you see things like they change your name when you, and that's another thing is like your name, tu nombre es en español, como si es, if it's Maria, they change it to Mary. My mom's name is Celia. And I always wondered, why did they change your name to Sally? Well, why are you trying to make them feel comfortable? Like that's your name. But I didn't start thinking about that until a few years ago. Like I knew it was oppression, but I felt it was like all in here, like my language, and it wasn't able to get it out. And so like with the kids, the same thing, like I want them to express themselves in their language that their parents speak at home. Like there's power in that. I don't want them to not speak it. So like I think ethnic dual language is really important with ethnic studies. If anybody else wants to add to that, like their own experience or like with their students in the class speaking Spanish and why it's important. Language is part of your identity.
I feel like my share connects a little bit, or you stirred some things up for me, Sabina. When you're, like we talked about, right, not having the vocabulary to describe things when you're younger and the things that you experience, I think what was challenging, and you know, like I do reflect a lot on my young self in this setting, right? Because it's a lot of thinking like, what pieces of myself really were taken from me before I had the vocabulary to ask for them back. And I think about that shame that gets built up. Like I'm learning my Tagalog again, but growing up, I didn't have access to that language in school, and no one knew what that was. So it was hard to be able to sustain my language. You know, there were things like, I remember bringing my lunch into school. My favorite food still today is sinigang. It's this delicious Filipino soup, and it's got this sour smell because it has this green tamarind in it, and there's like a little bit of fish sauce in there too. But I remember like people telling me that my food smelled bad, and like you build up this shame when you're younger, whether it's through like overt racism and like silencing of language and telling you like, you don't speak that language here, this isn't the space for like at school such and such thing. Those things start to get stripped away, whether or not we are able to teach it in the dual language model. But like when we teach things like hay belleza en ser bilingüe, like it's there's beauty in being bilingual. Here are all of the incredible assets that you bring every day you walk in the building. Like I'm thinking about culturally sustaining pedagogy, right? Treating the way like the wonderful founts of knowledge that students have, not only as like, well, that's cool, let's do school now. Like, no, that's beautiful and rich. And what can we do to like affirm and expand those cultural references? I feel like in the dual language school, like it's really critical that we use the lens of ethnic studies to talk about like, how are the ways that we fight to preserve our own culture? How are the ways that we can like really take joy in the things that we have, in the things that we bring into the room? Because also when we talk about being multilingual, for our Black and Brown students, most of the time it's like, oh yeah, like you're multilingual, like of course, like you have to learn to speak English. And we treat this for our white students like it's an asset. You're more marketable if you speak multiple languages. If we just continue with the status quo, that kind of piece continues versus honoring the rich language that people bring when they are a heritage speaker and they're acquiring another language. That celebration of that culture and of that asset is really important in dual language. Also, Carly, I would love to hear you speak at some point about what incredible advocates your students are for making sure they get their Spanish minutes. I've been yelled at a couple of times for speaking too much in English, and I feel like that's an important part of this too.
I'm sure I'll add on. I think ethnic studies has to be with dual language because I thought before I've had all of this important training and self-reflection, like, oh, we have a dual language program. Students will obviously just embrace the Spanish and not be racist and all these things because we teach in Spanish. But what being a second grade teacher, it was so easy just to say, isn't it beautiful? It's wonderful. Like, we're proud. And they're like, see, yes. But I've noticed in other schools as well, where I taught in Yakima, that as they get older, the more messages they start to absorb from society and our own school that we're trying to work on, that Spanish is not as valuable, it's not as important. And Maggie and Kevin and I actually talked as well. They're like, yeah, we already are starting to see inklings of that. And so I was like, that's my first unit. And I talked with Cynthia about it, and we planned it together. Is when I saw the language framework that Ethnic Studies Now made, I was like, that's exactly what we need to do in the upper grades to have them make that connection that between racism and colonialism, and why do we have a dual language program. And we actually did the math too of the schedule, because I had them help me make the schedule, like how many minutes do we actually have of Spanish, how many schools have other languages, why do we have this, and then framing it with the indigeneity, kind of making it separate from the Spanish for a second to talk about Indigenous languages. And there's so many powerful, beautiful books like Stolen Words, a poem called I Lost My Talk, and then videos that you shared with us, Tracy, of spoken word. And they just took it all in, even the Andrade one about your culture's your medicine. They said that every single day, and that making that connection that through colonialism, that's the first thing people take to control you is your language. And so really analyzing that and studying it, and then starting to connect it back to the Spanish. And it finally, because of all that work we've done as a school, they were able to easily make that connection, and with their own identity to realize what a deeply valuable thing it is to have another language, especially for the native speakers, that it's your medicine, it's your heart, it's your culture. And reading that powerful literature from Indigenous people, and the fight and activism to bring it back, that you are combating that by learning your own language. And a lot of them are looking into their Indigenous language that they lost. And so that's another way to find the joy and the power that and that Indigenous people are doing now to reclaim their language. So yeah, it's never ending, but also with dual language, it doesn't just automatically, you have cultural competency that you have to have that ethnic studies with it, or it's just a commodity. That, yeah, so I could keep talking forever about this, but what do you think, Cynthia?
Gracias, Carly. Yeah, I also think that having and using an ethnic studies framework to guide your work also problematizes the idea with it that we see in dual languages, you know, this idea of like standard English, standard Spanish. And I think it reminds us, and that's why that translanguaging piece is so powerful, is because it reminds us that that language is in constant flux, and it's constantly evolving, and language is always going to be valid, because like you've all hinted at, is such an important part of our identity, right? And so having this ethnic studies framework also allows us to push back when we're only centering academic English, academic Spanish, and we do that in Spanish too, you know. And I think sometimes we get away with it again because we're trying to uplift the Spanish so much, because we want students to find, you know, to kind of feel proud of that. But without it, and without you know, a critical lens, we again normalize this idea of standardness, of you know, academic language, and so that can also be a deficit. But with this idea in mind, with this idea of reminding us that language is at the core of identity, we're able to use and grasp all of our language resources to produce and to share who we are in the classroom, right? I think that without it, we'd easily fall into that deficit view of speaking correctly in Spanish, speaking correctly in English. And so I think it's an important framework that allows us to validate students in all the different ways that they want to share themselves when it comes to language. And so that's important. And I see that that work is done at Concord, you know, whereas I feel that other programs, because they're dual immersion, easily fall into that into that practice of thinking of the dual language program as just pushing academic English, academic Spanish. And so I think that's an important component of the work that really validates the range of ways that students express themselves through language.
Only small thing I would add to this, it's really interesting hearing all this as the only person here who teaches in English all day. It's really interesting seeing the ways that even third graders at the beginning of the year already come in with these internalized oppression about the Spanish language, or their language is other than English. Like a perfect example was we were doing some work on the element of culture within our identity, and one of those was language. So we were talking about language, and then we were looking at another element, and the question we were discussing was like, what is one of the like classic culture questions, what is a food from your culture or a drink from your culture? And someone was like, oh, like I know what I want to say, but I don't know how to say it in English. And I was like, well, they were like, well, my favorite food is, and then they're like, ¿Cómo se dice chamorado in English? And I was like, you don't have to translate that. Like that's the essence of what that is. You don't need to translate your culture to fit just because we're having this discussion in English. Like that is the essence of your culture that you're bringing to this, and the essence of your identity that you're bringing to this. And it was just like one of those examples where I just was looking, kind of from the outside in, of the student in this moment is trying to fit their own identity into what they think this box should be in a white supremacist like education system. And I think in the moment where I was like, that you just said it, that's how you say it. They were like, oh, okay, then that's my favorite drink. Like it was just a small, tiny example of like a really liberating moment for a student where they're like, oh, I can just show up as my full self. Even though in this class, we are learning and reading and writing and speaking and listening in English, I can still bring these elements of who I am. So it's an interesting perspective. It's very different teaching in English, whereas all of you get to see the hesitance to speak in Spanish, or, maybe you do. I see the opposite, where they were not really speaking in Spanish, but even the opportunities where I'm inviting them to, I do see that hesitance still. So it's really powerful to encourage them to bring their full selves into that conversation.
Okay. I had other questions, but I feel like we already answered them, but I'll name them. So one was, what has your transformation been like moving from traditional pedagogy to an ethnic studies pedagogy? And then y'all have addressed this one really well, is how do you make sure you're teaching for justice and joy? I've heard that come through a lot. So either what has your transformation been like, or just final thoughts, because we have about 10 minutes left. So I'll open it up.
I think one of the things that I would add, apologies, in terms of the transformations that I've seen in my pedagogy is intentionality, right? I think ethnic applying and developing and using an ethnic studies framework constantly asks you to reflect. Like, how is this relevant to my students? How is it connecting them to the world outside of the classroom? And it's this constant process of reflection that I think is critical to our profession, that we're often not encouraged to do a lot, because we're just given this scripted, curriculum. And so when you do this work, it's a constant process of reflection about the content, about the way that it's connecting to students, about the way that they're responding to it. So it's a work of love. It's a labor of love to implement an ethnic studies framework. And I think it adds, it's value added to our profession, because our profession is a critical one. And I think often we strip it away from its criticality, right? And so implementing and using an ethnic studies framework just brings it back, right? So that's one thing that that I appreciate from doing this work.
I wanted to add that it's been powerful this year because like just from the ethnic studies now, how it needs to be authentic, and the learning is always like everything going like interdependent. Everybody's like in community. And so like the kids, when we talk about how do they feel, a lot of the times they're feeling happy. And if they're not, they come up to me and say, I'm really frustrated right now, or they're using their voice. And so they're like, I think we need to talk about it. This is not right. And like, so they see injustices like on the playground, within the school. And I'm like, all right, let's talk about it. And it fits right into like social studies, science, like with the Duwamish River. And it's all authentic conversations that they're driving, like their own identities are driving it for their communities, like the action projects. But there's the standards, and like, I just like told myself that, okay, there's the standards. Oh, you got to have the standards. This, you got to have the standards. That. When you're planning your ethnic studies units, you have all that in mind, and it just naturally comes authentically while you're having conversations with kids. And I think that's really powerful because that's how they're going to be. They're going to use everything they're learning in school and the outside world. You know, they're part of the community, not just because they're 7 years old. They're a big part of the community. Like they're making change at Concord, and they're making change at the South Park with these projects and conversations, and everything's embedded in there. Everything's embedded as science, social studies, you know, ethnic studies, the framework, everything's in there. And I see the kids happier and their voice being heard. Like every single kid in the class wants to go up and present. Every kid, like I wanted to, you know, they go up and they're really excited about it. This is like the first year that every single kid goes up and presents, even the shy kids. Like they're not so shy anymore because their voice matters.
I'll jump in there because yeah, when you were saying, Selena, like they're excited to share, they're excited to present, they're excited to like be invested in this. I don't think I've seen students as like on fire to like share things about themselves and their community as I do when like we're using cultural references to like our immediate community. I think one of the things that was most important to my transformation as an ethnic studies educator was really examining my own relationship to the land that we're on. We're in the Duwamish River Valley, right? And so when we've been talking about what are the things that we can learn from the water? What are the things that we can learn from the river and the ways that we care for it and the ways that we care for the land? Students would be like, well, when I went to the river last, here's the things that I saw. Even my students that were like less likely to share, I showed this video of Ken Workman of the Duwamish tribe reading a poem by Alki Beach. And the students were like, oh, I've been there. I've been on that land. And they made that connection because it's their community. It's the land that we live on. It's the land that we are committed to caring for. And so when students have that connection, whether it's to the land that we're on, if it's themselves, it's to their ancestors, they're invested, they're willing to show up, and they're excited. The other thing that I feel is important to mention is when you're teaching with ethnic studies pedagogy or using the framework to design the content of your class, you also have to be willing to be implicated in the work that you're doing. And I mentioned before, you know, like I said, that the kids have yelled at me a couple of times for speaking in English too much, but I love those moments. And also it's more of a Mixter, no olvides que debemos de estar hablando en español durante la clase porque es muy importante para nuestros minutos. Like, this is very important for our Spanish minutes. We did the calculations with Miss Carly. We know that this is a space that we need to speak Spanish because it's our cultural preservation. This is what our goal is. Like, you have to be willing to be flexible with the students and understand that when they see harm, they're going to call it out, and you have to be ready and open for that, because when you listen to it, you get better. You get so much better as a teacher. And I think that's my favorite part, is being able to sit alongside the students when we've done a unit. And like today, we were reflecting on a lesson that we did last week. And the reflection that I got back from some folks that observed was that we were hearing from like a small group of students more than the rest of them. So I presented that problem to the class, and using the lens that they've developed with their classroom teacher and with myself, they were able to say, here's what we're going to do to make sure every voice is heard, because they have that investment in every space that they occupy. They recognize that it doesn't just have to do with the curriculum, though that's important, and the learning that's happening there, but it has to do with the way that I walk through the world. And the students will hold you accountable to that. So it's transformational. It's exciting and beautiful and brilliant.
Wanna go, Maggie?
I mean, I'd say some of my final thoughts would be, Selena, I was thinking when you brought up the standards and how everything sort of seems to naturally kind of fall into place. I think that something that has been so impactful about using ethnic studies frameworks is how it takes so much off of our load as educators, which is already so, we're buried underneath so much work and so many expectations from so many different places and people, that to strip down our work into really who we are and why we are here as a community, and like what we need to do to continue to make our community better, is really liberating, because you can always use that as kind of the heart of everything you're doing. And I think this year, one of my goals is to be more interdisciplinary and really make sure, specifically teaching math, that I'm weaving ethnic studies into math a lot more, which is definitely one of the more challenging areas. And I think with Carly's help and kind of talking through, again, that collaboration is really crucial, of how what that can look like. It's been really, really cool to see their connections to their mathematical identity as well, and I know that Kevin is doing similar things with their scientific identity and identity as a scientist, to sort of lift up each student in all of their multifaceted academic identities as well, to the point where now when we plan an activity, both Kevin and I did some, like, what does a scientist look like? What does a mathematician look like? And of course, we're putting what we think, or how we would have answered that question as kids or adolescents or adults. And they just, like, it almost doesn't work, because they're like, anyone can be a mathematician. Like, I'm a mathematician. And we're like, that's so cool though. Like, my lesson totally flopped because I was, the whole thing was we were gonna kind of unlearn. And I was like, oh, you don't even need to unlearn, because you've been doing this work at Concord now for 3 years. So now we can just build on it. So I think that's something really powerful I've seen, is that because this has been threaded through vertically all of the grades, and all of the content areas, including specialists, I'm seeing that we can really have richer conversations right off the bat, because they already have that foundation by 3rd grade.
Yeah, I heard people use heart and love, and the word I was going to use was soul. Actually, it gives a soul to the standards and our teaching. Yes, and a beauty. I heard that from Jessica too, that why are we doing all of this? I even have on the board, I try to put the ethnic studies with it. Like, I can find the author's craft and I can predict the author's message, but I have why up there, so that we investigate the relationships between identity, ancestral origins, history, belonging, or lack thereof, and language and storytelling. It just gives the why are we learning any of this? And then in math, when you do it too much, if I just have a regular problem, I remember a student asking before, but why? Like, what does this have to do with anything? I was like, it's just a problem right now we're doing. And she's like, oh, this doesn't mean anything then. Why are we even doing this? But it just gives, yeah, a soul to the standards in our teaching. And especially when you feel that in community with others, like right now, just this conversation is so motivating for me. And the students and like the students walking around, Selena, we're seeing all your En La Catch posters and like, En La Catch, they're doing it too. And that's from Wasson and our training. And so it's just neat for the students and the staff just to see the community of that and the love that connects us all together into our community, I think.
Okay, any final thoughts? Because we're at an hour. And before we log off, I want to take another picture since Cynthia's here. We took a picture in the beginning. We'll take a picture with Cynthia too. But any other thoughts?
Working together with you all is just really extraordinary. I'm really proud of where we've come. So just want to say that.
Also that you are Mother Me.
Thank you, everybody.